There's a really interesting argument from a French writer on security that you may know, Mathieu Rigouste, which builds on Foucault to talk about the ways in which warfare tactics that begin with the military soon migrate into the police. So he'll talk about May 68 being a typical example of that, with the matraquage, the kind of battering of the truncheons that you had in Algeria. And clearly we've seen something very similar recently with Ferguson, where we all know that the hardware they're using in Ferguson is army surplus that's been sold off to police forces. What you've been talking about clearly suggests a military dimension of drone warfare and so on that might be quite hard to envisage being translated into the police, but nonetheless I don't doubt that they're doing that. Are we seeing any glimpses of where this will happen?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, well, in the States they worked pretty hard on changing airspace regulations, because the regulation of airspace is an important part of facilitating the use of drones in the domestic sphere over American territory. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of amateur and now more systematic government-supported use of drones for border surveillance and border control. Not only drones as well as other automated systems, not flying ones, for monitoring the Mexican-American border and so on. So yeah, absolutely, completely. And so I'm not mentioning any of that, but I suppose in the pharmacological possibilities of drones, there are lots of other potential journalistic and critical and artistic uses kind of emerging at the same time as well. So I'm sort of focusing on the military one, but certainly, yeah, the passage in that explosion of the security industry that that shock doctrine talks about, post 9/11. Yeah, there's a massive crossover there of bargains to be had for surplus technology and so on.
Thanks, Patrick. I just have a very stupid question, really. It's Mike over here. Hiya. No, it's. I think your examples of military experience, they provide wonderful examples of what a discretization and a digitalization of experience would be. But it's just from my limited experience of where Stiegler talks about this, it's other kinds of experiences that are at stake, and experiences in which there might be a better way to have an experience, to put it very simply. And I just wondered, however great your examples are at indicating what is going wrong with experience when it becomes technologized in this way, what would be is there any sense in which we could ask the question, what would a good experience of war be? What would a better kind of military experience be? Because you can imagine the argument from their side on these kinds of issues is that we're precisely doing something more ethical in the ways you suggested, in fact. Maybe even by giving soldiers the distance from the actual intense experience, one is allowing them to make more ethical decisions and to protect them and so on. And I just wondered, because it brought to mind Ernst Junger, for instance, and this strange idea of, that there's an intense experience, an authentic experience in hand-to-hand combat. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's certainly a major theme of Chamayou's book. And also of M. Shane Rees's in another way, is this question of how do you war? How can we possibly go there with anything that might be, kind of how can we regulate that anyway? It's a terrible situation and so on. But the traditions have been that there are persistent efforts to sort of regulate and try and insert some sort of control and delimit warfare. The sort of danger articulated in Rees's book, for instance, is that what happens here is that war kind of disappears. You're not really dealing with war anymore, and it kind of goes out of sight and out of mind as an issue, and you have something more like kind of monitoring and regulation and control of something at the margins of kind of considerations for the advanced powers, as it were. So there's kind of a danger there in a sort of a kind of a category redefinition of conflict, of politics, of the possibility of self-determination and so on. So that's kind of one set of issues. The other one is that in the distancing, I mean, one of the arguments raised by, this is the third part I didn't get onto, one of the propositions raised by the leading artificial intelligence scientists promoting the idea of designing lethal systems with ethical governance in them is that this is ideally going to be better. It's going to stop war crimes. It's going to stop excessive use of force, because these human animals in the heat of battle, they give in to their passions and their primal drives and they massacre, and machines aren't going to do that. They're just, if you design them correctly and have the right AI, they're just going to apply the laws of war and the rules of engagement that you've put in place, and then they're going to go out and do their job. And so they're actually promising to limit collateral damage and so on. So the two main kind of critiques or interventions of that, or one is that the possibilities of actually doing that seem completely so far in the future that they're pure science fantasy at the moment. It's purely an idea that you can have this ethical governor. So it's kind of an impossibility argument. But the second argument is that that's the area of how do you leave to a machine those kind of ultimate judgments about deciding what's the exception to the rule, and what the exceptional circumstance is when you should or shouldn't push the button, or what's the just thing to do. Should we at this point abrogate and delegate responsibility to some sort of algorithm to determine that? So yeah, war is error, struggle and strife is unfortunately part of the human story so far, but that doesn't mean that we should give up and imagine that there's a solution in some sort of automating it, because that, in a way it's the end of war and it's the beginning of something maybe worse.
Yeah, Patrick, I was just wondering about that distinction you're making.
All my friends are asking me questions. I planted all these questions.
But the distinction you're making near the beginning between a kind of post-colonial frame for thinking about drone attacks and a technological frame for thinking about them. You know, the final or latest, perhaps, epoch of grammatization characterizing Western individuation and so on. And I mean, I was just wondering if you thought those were opposed, or whether they could be somehow brought together, because I mean, actually, some of these drone attacks are immersed in quite complex local post-colonial politics. I mean, Pakistan, for example, I have a student working on media presentation of drone attacks in Pakistan at the moment, and actually the concerns of people in Pakistan about drone attacks are both on one hand the same, but also subtly different, because it's immersed in this debate about the role of Pakistani government and the military and all these other things, which are part of that wider post-colonial debate as well. So maybe you could just say something a little bit more about what you see as a relationship between those two.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Before you answer, we'll take another question, so you can maybe perhaps answer two at the same time, just to save a bit of time.
Just to make it more difficult.
Okay. So then I will actually cut two questions into one. One detail that struck me, and that is that you ended with Tango Lee. So I wonder whether his playfulness entails still a lesson for us, and why you ended with him. So.
Thank you. That's a good question. I don't know really clearly the answer. It just kind of occurred to me as a nice reference. But I think there's something in it, because the Tango Lee machine, it's both one that destroys itself, and it's called Homage to New York, right? So it has this very, it's a very situated kind of, here I am in New York, and here's the machine for you. But it's also reconstructing. In a way, it's also a reconstructing machine. So it's constructed to destroy itself, but in the process, it makes something as well. So it has that kind of potential to do something other or differently. But what exactly that is, except for, I mean, from our point of view, it's a ruin, it's a mess. But there's something ambiguous or uncertain about it. It's not simply just something that is purely destructive. I don't know. I'm not really a master of what that means, but it seems to me like a really interesting. There's something about the enigma of this tendency, this process. We can't actually predict what exactly it's going to do. Which is to go to your question. I think you're right. That's why I said, in some ways, I'm trying to suggest that it's a kind of a spinning out of control of the post-colonial, which is also part of the post-colonial tendency, because the colonial history of the last 300-400 years is kind of, it is the history of globalization. And that's what this question of I mean, the thing that sparked this for me was in Technics in Time 1, Bernard mentions, I think it's not Bachelard. He's referring to somebody talking about the sort of second beginning of the human in Greece and in writing, in the discovery of writing. Second origin of the human or something. It's around, you're talking about the disaster in the astral and the disaster of the West. So anyway, to me, it's, we're very familiar with and comfortable with the idea of saying, the West is it's an ideological concept and it doesn't make any sense, and we should be thinking about the margins, and to always be thinking from the West outwards is repeating the colonial position. But I think that we have to sort of pay attention to this history of colonisation and now post-colonisation, and think of it. These technologies have come from the West, and they've helped the West colonise the world. So there's a kind of question here about what comes after the West, which is a legitimate question, I think. So I guess what I'm trying to evoke there is that here is a kind of something which is getting out of control. If the post-colonial is a sort of as it is in Leotard, a kind of a project that's just a transformed version of totalitarian control, now done more by economics and global policy and so on. This is not sustainable, I think. And I think this aspect of the automisation of this process of controlling the far-flung regions of the West is, to me, like a point where that's becoming very apparent, I think.
Yes, shortly. First, I want to answer your question concerning final or latest. I don't know.
Okay.
Now, when I say final, it is final. It is not. It is. When I say latest, it is the last. It is the last, not final. But nevertheless, your question is absolutely relevant, because this is the question. Now, I just wanted to add something to your lecture for continuing the discussion with the previous lecturers. That is the problem of the technical individuation. In your lecture, we see extremely clearly that psychic and collective individuation are sustained by technical individuation, and when we see, for example, the drone industry developed with data analysis, etc., that this is developed in higher education, in entertainment, in etc., and this is a global process of individuation of techniques. And my interpretation of Simondon, which is not Simondonian, is that there is no psychic individuation without technical individuation. And this is our problem today. And it particularly in what you said and you showed.